Good evening, everyone. John Michael Butler, aka the Multifarious Man, here. On tonight's Facebook Live edition of the Multifarious Man podcast, we had an interview with Cornelius Jones, a Democratic candidate for Florida's District 18 House of Representatives. He is a veteran of that was deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom, and while he was on active duty, he earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from Hartford University in 2005. He owns Jones Counseling and Consulting LLC, a private practice located in Jacksonville, Florida, and as a provider, he specializes in trauma. Now, for those that watched the Facebook Live stream of this interview, we did have some audio problems with my mic for the beginning of the actual interview. So what I'm actually going to share with you now is the majority of the interview while I continue to edit and actually bring to you the full edition that was recorded earlier. So what's following is the majority of the interview that picks up about 4 minutes in and then continues through the end. And I promise you, in a couple of days, if you check back here, you'll actually see the full interview with all of the audio restored. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
What's currently out there and do your part to become educated so you will know exactly how to go about approaching it the correct way. And I speak about it in the book through collaboration, working with other organizations to find out what they would like to see take place. I think that's responsible, but I also think it's irresponsible to get into office and change policies without giving consideration to how this will impede the lives of the residents.
So you made a good point there where you think about policy from the point of view of, well, how is it going to impact people? And I think that's quite important, where sometimes when people, it just seems to me as an outsider, when, watching the pundits on television and watching politicians who have made their life of being politicians, it doesn't seem to me, it seems like they came in with an idea of, well, this is what I want to do. And it doesn't matter what the impact is. I stand for X, Y, and Z, where instead of looking at, well, what do the constituents actually want? What are the people that I actually am representing? What are the needs? So how do you come up with, well, once you look at an idea and then trying to come up with a solution? Do you just approach it as, well, this is a problem and, I just need to tell you there's a problem? Or do you take a look at it and say, well, what are the best ways to come up with a way to solve for it?
So what I do is I typically research it. I research exactly how many people this impacts, but I also go to individuals who may be directly affected by it. And I ask them, how would you like for me to move forward, or how would you like your legislator to work on your behalf to resolve this? One of the things that I've done to this point is, as I'm doing my Meet the Candidate events, I ask people, what would you personally like for me to change once I get to Tallahassee? Most people don't really have a response to that because they use the same talking points that they've heard time and time again. But
Okay.
if someone asks you, what can I do to make your life better? That requires you to really think about what's currently impacting you and your family, and how you would like those things to change to benefit. Well, obviously, with that being said, I'm collecting data at that point. Because if this is a big enough issue, now I know that I need to shift my attention and focus to that particular thing.
Okay. All right. That's actually good. So another question I have is, what about people that don't know enough about not only voting and policies, and what are the things that you recommend for people that, just don't know enough? Like, how should they approach it? And what are some points that you could bring to them?
Well, in the chapter on voting, I talk about the importance of changing the way that we approach voter registration. I think that in order for us to get a better voter, a more educated voter, we have to not assume that everybody is glued into talk radio. We have to be prepared to say, hey, here's what a city councilman should do. Here's what the county commissioner should do. Here's what a state representative should do. So you got to take it back to the basis to give them a better understanding of how local policies affect the state and how state policies affect the nation. Because a lot of times people are only paying attention to what happens on Capitol Hill, but they're ignoring all the things that directly impact their neighborhood. They're not paying attention to the programs that are available for them that's being determined at town hall meetings. So if we can do a better job of getting people to understand, to not just focus on what's happening on Capitol Hill with the war that constantly goes on between the parties there, but get involved, and as well as know who your city councilmen are, who's the, like, for example, over in Orange Park, a lot of people didn't realize that there's a vice mayor there in a county or in a town that only has 8,400 people. So those small things are important because you need to know who to go to when you have issues, and it may not be appropriate to go directly to your state representative or your congressperson to resolve those issues.
I think that's important. Everything from, your school board to, how different things, how monies are allocated within cities and towns. And, every city and township is a little bit different, which you find out. And I think it's important for the constituents when they move to a specific area to find out how their city or how their town works. Because like you said, you could be, calling the wrong person and asking for the wrong thing. And, what is that going to give you if it's, if you're not going to the right place, and all it's going to do is get you frustrated, sending emails, sending texts, calling people. How does that help if you're not actually reaching out to the right person? So I want to go back in time a little bit. And this was something coming out of your book. So like I've told you before, I was born and raised in New York City, and I was still living in the region when the 9/11 attacks happened. But for you, your military service started before that. Can you kind of give me a little bit of background about what led to it, and what was going through your mind, not only to enlist or what led to it, but then later on when the 9/11 attacks happened?
So I was at home and I saw on the news where the USS Cole was attacked on October the 12th of 2000. And I remember sitting there being outraged at what had just taken place and where lives were lost. So I got off the couch and I went to the Gwinnett Place Mall, to the recruiting office there in the Metro Atlanta area, and I joined the military. And they asked me, hey, why are you coming in? Now, this is before they realized that the ship had even been hit. They didn't discover that the ship was hit until I was already at the recruiting office.
Wow.
So they were getting all kind of phone calls as I was sitting there, and I told them, well, it's time for me to answer the call to serve. Something has happened, and of course I felt compelled because so many young men before me had made that same decision when it was necessary to do so. So I joined the Navy on October 26th, which was 14 days after the USS Cole attack. So I went into it knowing that there was a possibility that I would be involved in whatever resolution that the government decided. The only thing I didn't know was that it was going to require me to miss out on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year. So but the good news is I was able to get through it. But also at that time, here's something else that was taking place, and I had no control over it because I was in basic training. This is when President Bush and Al Gore was running for office. So that election, I was in basic training. And one of the things that my drill instructor said to me, he said, told us, it doesn't matter who gets elected because they're going to be your commanding officer anyway. Because my question was, so because we're in basic training, we can't vote. And of course, that was the first time I ever heard of this mail-in ballot for military personnel.
Okay.
But also discovered that it wasn't true. They never brought us and allowed us to take part in that process. And I don't know if it was because we were in basic training or what, but of course that was an eye opener for me. That the person who will ultimately make the decision on whether or not what action we would take, I wasn't allowed to be a part of that process. And of course, that's when Florida had the whole
Hanging
um,
chads.
and then something else sinister took place during that time. There were so many military personnel who votes weren't counted here in the state of Florida. And I later learned that many of those active duty service members who was registered here in the state of Florida, they were showing up to the polls and being told that they were disqualified because in the system, instead of it showing that they were in the military, it was showing that they were incarcerated.
Wow.
And that was here in the state of Florida. Now I didn't put this in the book, but it was a reality. So fast forward, I get to my first command, which was the USS John F. Kennedy out of Mayport, Florida, and after about 5 months, the USS not the USS, but that's when 9/11 happened. Now we had just literally left New York at that time during Fleet Week, and the city embraced us. We had a wonderful time. We had an opportunity to get some of the last pictures from the Twin Tower on the 110th floor. And to this day, I still have those pictures because I know that I'll never have another opportunity to go back and take those pictures again. But seeing that attack on New York, it really pulled something within me because we had literally just left there back in, a few short months earlier. So we had people on the ship that was from New York who lost family members as a result of it. But to see that the Twin Towers were hit, the Pentagon was hit, and I remember the emotions on board that ship, and there were more than 3,000 people who were absolutely speechless on this ship, something that was normally extremely loud and noisy. But I also knew at that point that there was no way that we weren't going to war. And a short time later, George Bush, the president, came to Mayport, and I remember them telling me I had to go sit behind them. And jokingly, the entire time, the only thing I talked about how big those Bush boys' heads were. I was like, man, seeing their heads up close in person, like they got some huge heads. But I'm also listening to this speech, and I'm telling the people that's next to me, and I have that picture to this day where I'm behind him. And I'm like, hey, this is the pump them up to go to war speech.
And I have to think, I mean, it had to be kind of those mixed emotions on that ship. It's the helplessness of not being able to do anything, but then also the fear of knowing what it meant, where, you're in the military. And I can imagine, I've never served, my father is a Vietnam veteran, but I could just imagine is going into the military, going through training, that there's a possibility that you could be in combat or be in war or whatever, your life is actually in danger. But then that realization sitting on that ship to see what happened during the attack, and now knowing, this is getting real, and then to that speech and the buildup. But I think that the bigger part of it, and it's something you mentioned a little bit earlier, where, the difficulty or the access to ballots or people's status was incorrect. And I think that's why it's so important. And, you hear more about it in the news, unfortunately, in a negative way, when they're talking about, fraud or what they say is fraud. But I think the real issue comes down to is people knowing what their rights are, people having access to the ballot, because it's the one thing that we always stand on is, as a democracy, people have access to a ballot. You can't, when it comes down to what people choose when they cast that ballot, that's their right. But anytime I hear that someone doesn't have the right, that concerns me. And this is along the line of, to kind of segue, talking about how, the move to get felons to have their access to the ballot back. Because my personal belief is, it doesn't matter what crime someone committed. If you take away someone's right to vote, I do understand that there's a reason where people have to be incarcerated. I do understand their rules, but to take away someone's fundamental right, yes, you can, restrict their freedom, but the fact that people incarcerated and, depending on the felony, or in a lot of states, they don't have the right to vote, but yet they're still counted in the census. They're still counted as part of that population for that district. That's kind of frustrating. So that's one of the things I have a concern with, is that fundamental right to vote and how it's being restricted. And, not getting into, people saying that there's fraud. I'm talking about very fundamental. Do you have the right, and can you cast that vote? So can you kind of tell me your views on, well, one, anything that you've done as it related to ensuring or looking to ensure that felons have that right to vote, or kind of tell me your approach to some of the things that took place in Florida where it actually did get on the ballot?
So thank you for that. Back in 2013, myself, another frat brother by the name of Mark Ross, right here in Jacksonville, Florida, at my home, I was frustrated after discovering that individuals who had been incarcerated did not have a political um, voice when it came to how their taxes would be utilized, or anything else for that matter. And it made little sense. And let me take that back. It made no sense to me that a person can pay their debt to society and be a taxpayer, but yet is absolutely without a face or a voice, and ultimately don't get to determine where their money is even being spent at. So as I began to dig, I realized that it wasn't just a state of Florida issue; it was a United States issue. So what Mark and I did, and the original petition is still on change.org to this day. But I grew frustrated with that petition because at the time, I think we only got about 383 signatures online. Um,
Wow.
Back in 2013. So I told Mark, I said, well, hey, I think we should just print these out and we should just start going out talking to people. And it was amazing how many people had no clue that ex-felons could not vote. And at that time, I knew that we were on to something. So we get 10,000 signatures. Reverend Jesse Jackson came to Jacksonville at that time with Congresswoman Kareem Brown, Reginald Fullwood, and some others. And I managed to get an opportunity to speak with Congresswoman Brown as well as Jesse Jackson and told them about this. And I also reached out to Reverend Al Sharpton with the NAN network as well. So my whole hope was simply to draw attention to this, to where we could try to get legislation pushed to turn this thing around. And ultimately, after getting those 10,000 signatures, I personally sent it to the Department of Justice. This is when Eric Holder was still the Attorney General.
General. Okay.
And later found out President Obama, as well as um, the Attorney General, actually spoke out about, we need to do something about felons who don't have the right to vote. So for me to see Amendment 4 turn into what it did, it was almost like a parent watching their child grow. Like, and to that point, I had never said anything or tried to, seek credit for it, because it wasn't about that for me. It was about, hey, here's a problem and there has to be a resolution, but we got to make people aware that this is a problem before they can become outraged and recognize something needs to happen. And by the grace of God, that happened. It turned into something much bigger. And every time I see these groups now pushing for prison reform as well as for voting rights for ex-felons, I smile, but also, I smile because I know that I was a part of that process. And to see it become a national movement the way that it did, that will outlast me by many generations.
That's good to hear. I mean, I think it's important when you think about it. People serve their time, for whatever crime they committed. We want to say that people are rehabilitated. And one of the things to actually keep someone on the right path is access. If you don't have access to having your voice heard, or you don't feel like you're contributing to society, where is the desire? So all those different things that people need to actually get back into society, that voice, that vote, I think is probably the most important, because it leads to so many different other things. When it's kind of hard to care if nothing you do is going to matter. So I'm glad to hear, and I've been glad to see that this is one of those things that actually, for the most part, has been bipartisan, in the sense of everyone's impacted by this across the board.
Mhm.
Now, to speak of another issue, which I understand is very important to you, and this is the whole concept of trauma and surviving trauma. Some of the things in your book where you talk about your childhood, and some of the things you've witnessed, and seen, and to know that through your experience, there's certain things that people don't ask the question about. They assume that if someone lived through something, they're okay. If they get up and come to work every day, they're okay. Um, but the psychological side of what we're impacted are. Can you kind of talk to me about trauma and your approach and why it's so important to you?
Well, I'm the walking, I'm the poster child for trauma. Let me put it that way. Now, of course, when people talk about trauma, they see a lot of brokenness, but trauma doesn't necessarily have to resemble that. Trauma can, and in fact, I even share this thought with you. Then I'll jump back on track. My trauma manifests itself in many different ways. There's never a time in my life that I can just be comfortable or content with anything. So that has caused me to be what some would consider to be an overachiever. So if you think about this for just a moment, since August of 2020, I've written 4 books on top of running a practice, having a family,
Mhm.
and announcing my candidacy. But I operate extremely well in that, but it still is a result of trauma because my brain doesn't shut down. And if and when I have an opportunity to just sit and reflect over life and everything that I've witnessed, that's when my trauma sneaks up on me. So for some people, trauma leads them to drinking, alcohol, risky sex, all of these other things. And then you have another population to where we use that trauma to benefit us, but at the same time, it's still trauma. And anything that we suppress, we don't address. And a lot of times people go through life without addressing the trauma. They suppress it through those ways that I just made mention of, and it begins to reveal itself into their homes, their kids, and all of those things. I often say that if you don't correct that generational hurt, it turns into generational hate because you have to begin to get to the root cause of it. And in my book, I talked about growing up in an abusive household. I talked about witnessing a close childhood friend get murdered right beside me one night. So I have seen trauma up close and personal. So I decided to focus on trauma. And even at the time that I went into the military, I was probably institutionalized to some degree because I had come from a state reform school.
Mhm.
I went into a job course program that had a lot of the same well, similar behaviors. They had gangs, they had fights and stuff like that. And then of course for me going into the military, it only made sense. So instead of running away from an incident, like I said on October the 12th when the USS Cole, my brain was like run to it. But of course at that time I wasn't as in tune as I am now to these things. So I just saw it as a way of life because of those experiences growing up in an extremely violent neighborhood and household.
So thinking about your lifetime, I mean, from a young man where you've been involved in some sort of service to others, and your candidacy is another example of service to others. It's if you think back, and forget about all of the history of the founding of our country, and the things that they don't want us to talk about, and understanding how it was built on slave labor. I think the key point is, and not to belittle that and walk over it, is in the beginning when men at the time, because again, it was just women weren't able to vote or run, people of color weren't. But so when people went into public service, they came, they served, and then they went back to their regular job.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a lifetime appointment. It wasn't a way to get rich. It
Mhm.
was people really, whatever the reason, it was, and I think back to the Frank Capra movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and the, bright-eyed. And I think you mentioned this in your book. I think you have to assume that everyone goes into politics for the right reason. They want to serve for the right reason. It's not some hidden cabal where people are just trying to get power and take over the world. I think, and I believe, as a Christian, I believe you just have to believe that you have to give people this benefit of the doubt. Yes, we're all flawed, but I think people go into it. It's that service aspect of it. What is your definition of, or rather, what is your end goal overall? And it doesn't have to be something specific, but what do you consider success in this endeavor? So say you get elected, what is success in your eyes? And I like the fact that you talk about, one of the points you make is it's not about making promises. You talk about it's, what am I committed to? And there's a difference. And I, and kind of explain, your point of view on that. But what is your definition of what would be success?
For me, as a elected official, success would be accomplishing what I set out to do, and only what I set out to do, which is bring attention to the bills that I'm pushing to get sponsored, as well as co-sponsoring sensible legislation that's going to benefit everybody. If I'm able to do that at the during my time as a Florida House of Representative, then I've succeeded in that realm. Now, obviously, there will be things that will be outside of my control that I can't just push through. I would need support from others. And then the end goal, of course, I want to go from the Florida House of Representatives to the U.S. House of Representatives, but I only plan to do one term because what happens, going back to your point, is that I think that people go there for all the right reasons. And somewhere they become comfortable. And it's no longer about doing what's in the best interest of their district. It's about doing what's in the best interest of them keeping their district seat. And there's a danger to that. There's no reason we should have elected officials who have been in office for decades and decades. You have a term, you accomplish what you set out to do, and then you should move out the way. Because if you think about it from this right here, this perspective, it's like being in high school. You have 4 years, or even college. You have 4 years. Either you accomplish what you were supposed to do during that 4 years, which is walk away with your high school diploma or a college degree, or you need to go and look at doing something else. Politics are the same way. You have 4 years in most cases to accomplish something. If you haven't accomplished it, I believe that we have to really give term limits some real consideration, because we cannot just allow people to be going through this process without making progress. And that's what's happening. So they get excited only at certain times of the year where they are really, courting voters, Black voters in particular, and we fall for it time and time again. I don't believe in permanent parties, but however, I do believe in permanent interests. I think that that's very important, and more people need to give those things consideration, because if we've been fighting the same fights, regardless of who's been in office, for all of these years, and we still haven't saw progress, there's something is wrong. You can't get a job in too many places in America and not show progress and keep that job. Other than politics, you can do the bare minimum and still get reelected. I disagree with that. And so for me, I want to do just like former President Obama. I think what made him so effective, he had a fresh face, he had a fresh message, and he did the Illinois State Senate. That was one term.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went and he became a U.S. Senator one term. And of course, he served as president 2 terms. But toward the end of even his presidency, you could see where there's a burnout. And I don't think that that made him less of a president by any means. He was still phenomenal, but that just goes to speaking the evidence that when you've been doing it for two, because there's so many different things that's coming at them by nature, you're going to hit a wall and just like, listen, this is, I'm just waiting for my term to be over with. So to answer that question, Jamaica, that's kind of where I'm at with the whole process.
I think that's important, and I like that approach. I do agree. Term limits would be important because you can't just depend on people to make the right decision and walk away when they're not effective, because you get caught in that cycle. Unfortunately, it's the cycle of I'm spending so much time trying to keep my job that I'm not doing my job. Whereas if people look at policies and how it actually impacts their constituency, that would be more important, because you're like, well, I didn't get it done for Mr. Johnson or Mrs. Jones. So I need to move on and do something else, give someone else a chance that may have different ideas, because if you have diversity of opinion, you can, if everyone designed one thing, everything would look the same. And that's not how we're built. That's not how we're made. Everyone has a gift. Everyone has a different way to contribute, and to approach it in the sense of what's going to be the best for everyone. But again, not always seeing the approach of, well, I'm going to go with the way that the majority goes, because sometimes the majority is wrong. Sometimes the minority is right. You got to have a combination to be successful. But at the end of the day, the community and improving your community and to not do any harm, get in, get the job done and move on. And I think that's important because, seeing the same names for decades in some of these positions, it makes absolutely no sense. I don't care how great Michael Jordan is. I don't want to see him playing basketball at 75 years old.
So look, that leads me to something else. And going back to what you just said, I think that candidates as well as elected officials need to be critical thinkers. They have to be able to think for themselves. It's great to have people in your corner where you can, take that advice when necessary. But ultimately, you're the person that's driving that ship. In America, in order to be the president of the United States, you have to be 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So there's age discrimination on that side of it. But unfortunately, on the tail end of it, you can be 80 years old, 84 years old, still in office. So we're going to discriminate against young people who seek high offices
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to being a president. But you can be, almost on the deathbed before you leave office as a president. It's something wrong with that. And the other piece of that thing is I was talking to my team, most of the elected officials right now on Capitol Hill, age minimum is 60 years old.
Mm.
How many fresh ideas are they going to have? Yes, they have their legislative assistants who are young and who, kind of keep them up to speed with things. But for most of those individuals, they're already set in their ways. So there's little to be done. And then going back to the second part of the question that you asked me, I have been very clear on making commitments and not promises. I think that it's irresponsible for any candidate to make promises as they're running for office, especially when you are trying to do a job that you've never done before.
Mm-hmm.
How can I promise you something when I don't even know what every single day of that's going to entail? However, I can hold myself accountable to the things I'm committed to, and so can my constituents. If I say that once elected, I'm going to make affordable housing a priority, and I don't do it, now the voters can come back and say, you said that this was going to be, I haven't saw any legislation that you pushed. If I say that closing the pay gap is something that's going to be at the top of my priority list, they can hold me accountable because I'm committed to those things. And I think that if more candidates as well as elected officials took that approach, then we can get away from this idea that all elected officials or all politicians are just liars, because that has been the norm for far too long.
I like that. I think that's important. And then you think about the fact that there are things that are out of control of, just because someone so holds a certain office, there are things that are beyond their control that just literally there is. And I don't think people understand that. Sometimes they look at the top of the ticket and, just like the failures of the person at the top and the successes are not 100% on that person. It's a combination across the board. So I think that's important. Commitment is, it's about will, it's about desire. You're not always going to get the results, but that's something you can see. It's like, yeah, I tried to do this, this, and this, rather than saying, I promised to do this and you don't have control or you don't know how to do it. And I think that's unfortunate. It's a way that people, it's almost like, well, if you vote for me, I'll get you a new car. It's not that exact, but it's basically those niceties that sound good, as opposed to like, no, I'm going to make every effort to improve your streets, your neighborhoods, your communities. When you hear about, unfortunately, the different things, and whether it's Black Lives Matters and how people feel they are beneficial, and how one side thinks they're not. When you hear things, phrases like defund the police, it's frustrating because the intent versus the message kind of get missed. Like, I understand what it means in the sense of, and I'll just put it simply, if your budget, if you have a city and 70% of your budget is for policing, there's a problem. Mm-hmm. There's not a problem with police. There's a problem with your priorities and where you're putting your money. If you're not putting your money into the community, it doesn't mean take away from the left hand. It means look at your budget and decide percentage wise, where do you think you should be spending more percentage? It's all about the percentages and where your focus is. And you can't tell a community that you support them if you're not putting money into social services, you're not putting money into the arts, you're not putting money into schools. You don't have to cut off the funding to one group, but you need to be smart about how you spend your money and how you spend your focus. And I think that's a key message that I just wish more people would hear what the process is behind it, instead of hearing a fancy slogan and then just deciding, oh, I don't like that. I think we need to take more time as constituents to listen to what our actual politicians are actually saying, not just what they're saying, but looking at what they're doing, paying attention to the bills that are being passed through. All of this is open. The records are open, the voting records, the forums, the bills that are put for it. And one of the things you mentioned in the book, it's about educating. We really need to make sure that the populace is educated to understand what our rights are, to understand what impacts us, and how do we affect change. And then being smart about the candidates that we're going to put our vote and stand behind, to make sure not only it lines up with our needs, but does it in a way that's not trying to harm another part of the population. It's like, you can't fix one thing if it's just going to attack someone else.
So I think a part of the challenge also goes to this: voters get caught up on titles, right? And I spoke about it in the book. Most of our politicians are attorneys. So they are wonderful with doing theatrics in the courtroom, but that doesn't mean that they are qualified to be leaders. And they don't really have often a history of service. So we are going to the polls, we're listening to these people who are trained to make arguments that work out in their favor. You can see that in their campaigns and a lot of things that they do. But what's missing is the service and the leadership component of it. So even for myself, even though I have an extended education, I've made it clear that I don't even want my doctor title used on anything political, because I want to be able to reach people where they're at. Now, yes, I have a compelling story where I went from a GED to a PhD, and all of that's great. But politics isn't the place for me to put that on display, because that may cause me to potentially lose some people who didn't have the opportunities that I had. So that's something we have to do a better job as voters, to not get so caught up on, oh, this person is an attorney, they did X, Y, and Z. Well, where's their service at? Do they have a history of service? If they don't have a history of service, and it's all been about themselves, then what should make the voter believe that suddenly this person, and I'll just put it where the ghost can get it, Donald Trump, for example, he has always been a businessman. Nothing about this man ever said that he was qualified. He had made commitments and he had given back to communities or anything else. And American failed for it. And we saw the end result of that. So a part of that rests on our shoulders as well. And this isn't me kicking the former president's back end or anything, but this is just a reality. And then the other piece of this is a lot of elected officials, when they get to the federal level, they're already independently wealthy. So when people say that this person is for the poor and this other person isn't, that's not the truth. Because a lot of times they're trying to protect their own interests, and that's the reason they get involved. We've seen how many multimillionaires and billionaires that were a part of Trump's administration. They didn't need the money. It was all about control and power. So that's what we have to do a better job at examining and calling a spade a spade.
I think that's important, that service model, and understanding what people's motivations are. I think that's really relevant and important. You're right. Because if you think about it, there's a big difference between how someone runs a business and how someone governs, because the purpose of a business is to turn a profit. That's the main fundamental difference. A government, it's to serve the people. It's not to try to make money. It's try to make sure that you are able to, that everyone can be successful in the sense of they have their basics. You don't want to have homeless. You want to make sure people have education. They have healthcare, all those different things. They have roads, they have police, they have fire departments. And those things cost. If you're doing it to turn a profit, then you're doing the wrong thing. Yes, it's nice when there's a surplus because it makes it easier to do things. But what it should do when you have a surplus, it means that you can put more money into other projects that don't always get the top billing or the top dollar. So I think that really is important. We didn't get one question, and this is directly related to District 18. What is your main commitment, or what are the top things that you're committed to for the district that you're running for?
For District 18, one of the priorities, I truly want there to be inclusion rather than exclusion. I think we have a growing population in Clay County. The demographics have changed, but unfortunately, the representation of Clay County has not changed. As I have stated before, in 163 years, since Clay County has been established, there's never been a person of color that has been elected to office. That's a problem. And I want to help that attitude change, because there are sectors in Clay County who they're so afraid of change that we're 6 months removed away from the presidential election, but they're still flying these Trump 2020 flags. So that's just evidence that they're not ready for change. And in Clay County, our challenges are very unique in comparison to, let's say, over in Duval County. But when I think about, we have 55% women in Clay County, and 41% of those females in Clay County actually meet criteria for poverty, then that's a problem all within itself. So that, I would have to say that in terms of trying to create ways that females and as well as the district can generate revenue to keep and create jobs, that is something that's important, because right now more than 70% of the residents of Clay County are actually commuting to Duval County just to go to work. And that makes no sense when we have 225,000 people. We need to be able to have jobs that people can go to within 10 to 15-minute drive from their homes.
Excellent. That's important. And to give people a kind of greater understand the greater Jacksonville metro area. Jacksonville, Duval County is what's considered the Jacksonville city proper. The surrounding counties are Clay County, Nassau County, St. Johns County. So when people hear about Jacksonville, it's it's that surrounding area. And, where Cornelius is running is within Clay, which is one of the counties within the surrounding area. So, Jacksonville itself has a major river that runs through it. So there are a lot of bridges there, many thoroughfares. It's actually a really pretty big military town. We have a naval base here. So there's actually a lot of people in this area that are retired military. A lot of people, retired police officers or fire department, either coming from the Northeast. I myself am a migrant from New York City to Florida. I've been in Jacksonville for nearly 20 years now. It's a growing city to that point. It does continue. It used to be the place that people drove past on the way to Disney World or to Miami, but Jacksonville is actually, in the surrounding area, is a growing. Northeast Florida itself is growing so fast, and it's good to know that we have people like yourself that are actually interested in serving and giving something back to the community that we live in. So, what are some ways that people can get an opportunity to meet with you? Do you have any? What are some events that you have coming up? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Well, this Thursday, which will be June 24th, over at Eagles Landing Golf Club, I will be doing a Meet the Candidate event. Also, at that time, I'll be doing a book signing. And what the Meet the Candidate events to me is, it gives people an opportunity to come in and just simply address whatever those concerns that they may have. I think talking about myself isn't as nearly as important as hearing from other people, because it's not about me trying to sell myself, but me to get a better understanding of what the issues are, as well as things collectively as a community that we can do to correct some of those issues. Because I think it's important to not just show up with problems. There has to also be resolutions attached to that, because that's what I'm going to need once I get to Tallahassee to rectify these problems. And I'm starting that by doing these Meet the Candidate events. I did the first one back in May over at St. John's River College. I'll be doing one on the 24th at Eagles Landing from 6:30 to about 9:30. There will be some hors d'oeuvres served over there as well. So that's going to be, off of Argyle Forest, where it turns into Oakleaf. And then also there's other events that's coming up. But in order, if somebody wants to get in contact with me, they can follow me on all of my platforms, which will be Cornelius D. Jones. That's for Twitter. That's also for Instagram as well. I'm sorry. So Instagram and Twitter is going to be at Cornelius D Jones, as in David. And then my website is electjones2022.com. My platform is on there. Ways that they can make contributions are on there as well. And then I also have a separate website, which is corneliusdjones.com, which is where they can get any of my publications and, read more about, I guess, me as a person on there as well.
Okay, looks like we have another question. Being that the school system is the biggest talk of Clay County right now, what is your goal for working alone with them or working along with them?
Well, thank you. So I think it's important to also get in front of educators, because educators are going to provide the best data in terms of what those challenges are. It's easy to be on the outside looking in and saying, because I'm a parent and I have kids that are in Clay County school system, but what I know as a professional, that you always want to go to the people that's doing the work to find out what they need so that they can better serve those students that they have. Because, we on the outside looking in, and we don't know what those meetings that they have with the principals and the superintendents and things really consist of if they're closed to the public. So working with teacher unions to find out how I can better assist them. But I certainly want to say this, I do not have any desires to try to take away pay from members of the school board. I think that that's essential for us to have people, citizens that are concerned about our children's education and the future leaders of not just Clay County, but this nation, to make sure that they're getting what they need in the classrooms.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out today. I really appreciate it. It's really been good talking to you, hearing about you, kind of giving everyone a chance to meet the candidate. I like it, leading change. And I like the idea of committing to ideas and not making promises, because commitment is something that can be tracked and identified. And I think it's something that all candidates should make that approach, because how you approach policy, how you approach educating the population, and the things that you're looking to do that will impact anyone is, I mean, it's a worthy cause. So I'm looking forward to hearing more. I definitely would love to speak to you again at another time. But that's it for today. Thank you so much. Again, it's on Cornelius. I mean, it's electjones2022.com to find information about the platform and more about the candidate. That's it for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.